Hi everyone, so today's video is going to be how to stand out in the slush pile coming from a slush pile reader. So this video is going to particularly focus on short fiction, and that's because I'm a slush reader for short fiction. If you didn't know, I read, I think, for 4 editorial boards. I've read total for 5. I have various different roles at various different magazines, but one of my jobs at several of the places I volunteer at is to read submissions from the slush pile. So what is a slush pile? According to Wikipedia, a slush pile is a set of unsolicited query letters or manuscripts that have either been directly sent to a publisher by an author or which have been delivered via a literary agent representing the author who may or may not be familiar to the publisher. So essentially it's a giant pool of submissions and somebody needs to read those submissions. Those are going to be slush pile readers or first readers. So this is just a disclaimer that these are just things that I've learned from my experience. So of course it's going to vary between reader to reader. These are just a couple of things that I noticed about submissions that particularly caught my eye. So number 1, your first paragraph matters, and so does your first sentence. We've all heard an iteration of make sure your story has a great hook, but what does this actually mean? As a slush reader, I've come to understand that oftentimes the hook for a short story often lies in the first paragraph. First paragraphs are really a vessel to get a reader to the end of the story. Generally speaking, for a short story, it's where a reader decides whether or not they want to continue reading. Of course, a first paragraph is the first impression of a story that a reader gets. First paragraphs are also an introduction to voice, an introduction to the writer's style, and a glimpse into the story's central conflict. So why do first paragraphs matter to me? Well, in a lot of ways, first paragraphs are sort of mini stories on their own. Not that there's a full arc in terms of the paragraph, but that after you're finished writing the story, you can often look back at the first paragraph and see how it hinted at where the story would go. Like I said, this is the very first impression of a story that I'll get. That doesn't mean the first paragraph has to be flashy in order to capture my attention, but at the end of the day, it has to capture my attention. What do I personally look for in a first paragraph? So I gave 3 points previously about what first paragraphs also do, and these are the things that I usually look for. First, an intro to voice. So I want to see a glimpse of who the character is. How do they talk? What is their world like? What makes them specific? Again, this doesn't have to be flashy or quirky. It just has to be unique to the person telling the story. So the second thing I look for is an introduction or sort of hint at the writer's style. In the first paragraph, I want to see how a writer writes. So in these instances, put your best foot forward. A really great way to make a strong first impression is to write a really tight first paragraph. Concision here for me is really key. So give me enough info to draw me into the story, but not so much that I'm drowning in exposition. Finally, I look for a glimpse into the story's central conflict. Obviously, we're not going to get a full-fledged 3-act structure in the first paragraph, and I definitely don't recommend that you do that. What I want to see, however, is a hint at what the conflict is going to be. So what am I getting as a reader? Again, the first paragraph doesn't have to be flashy. It just has to be interesting. So here are 2 examples of opening paragraphs of short stories. These are published stories that I really love. The first is Randy Travis by Suvankam Tamavangsa. The only thing my mother liked about the new country we were living in was its music. We'd been given a small radio as part of the welcome package from the refugee settlement program. There were other items in the box, such as snow pants, mittens, and new underwear, but it was the radio she cherished most. A metal box with a dial that picked up a few channels. The volume button had only 3 ticks, and then it couldn't go any farther to the right. She held this little radio up to her ear like a seashell and listened. The host always spoke briefly between songs, and there was the occasional laugh. A laugh in any language was a laugh. His laugh was gentle and private and welcoming. You got the sense that he, too, was alone somewhere, grateful for the sound of a human voice and for the music that kept her company. She listened to the radio constantly while I was at school and my father was at work. So I love this first paragraph. It's an example of a lengthier first paragraph. You get a lot of information. We learn so much about the mother in such a small space. For example, her obsession with the radio versus the other items in the box that are important, like the new underwear, but that she isn't super enamored with in comparison to how interested she is by this radio. That immediately stands out to me. She's most enthralled by the entertainment of this radio, not necessarily the necessity of the other items in the box. The thing that really seals the deal for me is the image of the mother holding the radio up to her ear like a seashell. It's such a specific, fantastic, bizarre almost image that makes me curious about the voice and the character of this mother. I want to read more. I want to learn more about her. Forthcoming does something very smart with the comparison of the radio as a seashell up to the ear, because we've all seen that image of somebody holding like a conch shell up to their ear, but to see it with a radio that is so different, it's not naturistic, it's man-made, it's technological. That's such an interesting twist on that image that is so typical that we've seen in so many instances in media, in books. So the next opening paragraph is completely different, and this is going to be from Teardown by Clea Young. We were the couple having a domestic on Saturday afternoon in IKEA. We might as well have been on stage. We were that well lit. So this is a very brief opening paragraph in comparison to the one written by Forthcoming. It's literally just 2 sentences, but the specificity of the IKEA introduces a modern quirk to the voice that's very relatable. The characters are not just in a furniture store, they're in an IKEA. And IKEA has its own air of theatricality or set dressing. It's almost like being on a stage. I think that fits really well with the second thing that the character says in that second sentence. We might as well have been on stage, we were that well lit. Immediately I want to learn more about this couple arguing in an IKEA. Are they hoarding the pencils that IKEA has, like, you know, in those little dispensers? What are they looking to buy? Are they looking to buy one of those very classic IKEA Poang chairs, or one of the IKEA moon lamps that I'm sure that tons of kids have in their bedrooms? Just one word, IKEA, makes it so interesting to me, and I want to continue reading on. So the second thing that you can do, in my opinion, to stand out in the slush pile is ensure the concept is clear by the end of the first page. Short stories are specific moments about a specific thing that occurs to a specific person at a specific time. And if that specific moment is not clear, aka if the story's concept is not clear, by the end of the first page, my attention might wane. As noted in the previous point, I want to understand the story's main conflict by the end of the first page. It doesn't need to be super clear to me. I just want to have a bit of an understanding, a bit of an inkling. So understanding the concept is similar to this because the concept will tie in to the conflict. So if I'm disoriented by the end of the first page and I'm not sure what's going on and that wasn't the writer's intention, it can be harder to keep my attention as I'm reading. And the same goes for when I'm reading published stories. So this doesn't mean you have to spell everything out on the first page. That's what a story is for. You're trying to explore the idea. But I'd like to have a hint or a bit of an idea of what the writer's intent was by the end of that first page. I want to have an understanding of sort of the direction. I don't need to be super clear on it. Some ambiguity is actually very welcome, some mystery, but I sort of want to understand the overall log line of the story. So here are a couple of examples. So I've picked out the first 250 or so words because that would usually be about the first page of a couple of short stories that I really like. And the first is going to be from L'Étranger by Eliza Robertson. After my master's degree in England, I moved to Marseille to let my hair grow. I lived with a Ukrainian woman in an apartment with stick-on floor tiles that peeled from the corners of the walls. I tried to not look at the corners too closely, or the walls themselves, which were tacked with ribbed, oily paper. The apartment was ground level. When it rained, slugs slinked under the gap in the door. These weren't banana slugs from BC, but slimmer and nut orange. Their trails shone in the glow of my cell phone when I walked to the bathroom at night. I used my cell phone for light so I wouldn't need to touch the walls for the light switch. Arena carried hers for music. Beyonce while she cooked or bleached her underwear in the bathtub. I always knew where in the apartment she was standing. Every week, Irina boiled potatoes on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. She peeled the potatoes into the sink and left the skins in the drain. I had to scrape the peels to the side of the basin before I could rinse my lunch plate. Because I washed my hair on the same days, I started to see the potatoes as her detachable body parts. The potato halves like heels she unscrewed from her feet, or milky lobes she plucked from under her knees. She had, let's say, certain tics. She hid dish detergent in the cupboard, though I bought a bottle when I moved in. So I would ask myself if I read this, what's it about? And I would say very clearly, this is a story about a woman's relationship with her seemingly strange or maybe quirky roommate. I don't know what's going to happen at the end. I don't know who the narrator is. I don't even know their age. I don't know their name. I don't know a lot of details, but I do know the overall concept, and it's true to the concept of what happens in the story. And I like that. I like being grounded at the beginning of a short story. So tip number 3 is that polished writing stands out. out. As a slush reader, I immediately notice polished versus unpolished writing in what I'm reading. This is even very subjective, but just in my opinion. So work that is concrete, specific, and with a strong voice is like kind of like a hidden gem. It's something that I get very excited about when I see it in the slush piles that I'm reading for, whether it's within the university student body for the magazine that I run on campus, whether it's for one of the other magazines that I'm volunteering for. If you feel your writing hits those boxes, then people are probably noticing. Like if you think that your writing is good, then other people probably think it's good too that are reading it. But that's why I think polishing the entire story, but especially that opening, is so critical as it creates that first impression. Unique and interesting language also stands out. Details that are quite fascinating. I mean, we have it in Eliza Robertson's story, the excerpt that I just read. There's some great specific details, but something that immediately stuck out to me was the description. These weren't banana slugs from BC, but slimmer and nut orange. Nut orange as a phrase is such a gorgeous way to describe something that is kind of gross, and that stands out to me immediately. I'd continue reading. So what do I look for in polished writing? Of course, again, this is subjective, but I look for usually clear voice. I look for specific, concise, and precise language, and I also look for some sort of grip on style. Suvankam Tamavongsa's story that I read the opening of, Randy Travis, is so different than the writing in L'Étranger by Eliza Robertson. Eliza Robertson has a bit more lyricism, a bit more poeticism in her style, whereas Randy Travis is a bit more straightforward. So it doesn't matter the style, it's just I want to see, does the writer kind of have a grip on how they write? So another way you can stand out in this slush pile is to pair basic concepts with a strong voice. There are certain tropes in fiction that like appear a lot in general, just in published fiction, but to submitting writers, I wouldn't really worry too much about that. But if you are writing a more basic or typical concept, something a little bit simpler, ensure that the voice is strong and the reader will most likely keep going. When you're writing short stories, you're writing about people. Humans go through similar things, but no two people are going to experience the same thing in the exact same way. That's what you want to capture in a short story. The subjectivity of a specific voice. So if you're writing about a simple concept, how does that voice make it diverge from what we've seen before? So the last tip is not really how to stand out in the slush pile, but just kind of a note, and that is that longer stories may be at risk. So this might be a personal preference, and of course I'm a reader at magazines. I'm not an editor anymore, so of course keep that in mind. But when I'm first reading stories, in my experience, stories that are above 3,000 words are going to have to work a lot harder than ones that are shorter than that. And I know 3,000 words is really short, and some readers might have like a higher threshold, but I've noticed that that's around my mark, like 3,000, 3,500. If anything, like the longest, anything below 4,000 words is something that is going to be a little bit more like in the like safer zone of word count, at least to me. So of course you're going to want to read the individual guidelines and the individual likes and dislikes of the editor that you're trying to submit to, and of course read the stories that they've recently published, because who knows, they might have published a ton of long stories and that's what they're into right now. It's not that I automatically reject or say no, maybe not for this story that is of a longer word count. The difficulty with longer stories is that you have to sustain a great story over a longer amount of pages and then convince a reader that the length was needed. So I'm going to talk about this in my personal experience. Something I noticed in my early short stories. Most of them were much, much longer than the stories I write now. They were like 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 words long. A lot of those stories have since been edited down to 2,000 to 3,000 word stories. So something that I've learned now looking at those different drafts, like a story that went from 5,000 to 2,200 words, for example, is that so much of the original content was unnecessary. And it's not that it was like bad or that it was fluffy content or that it was filler. It was just that I was doing too much for the story that I wanted to tell. It's content that is good that could be used elsewhere, but for this particular story, at this particular date, to this particular character, I didn't need all of that information. That does not mean that all longer stories or all stories above 3,000 or 4,000 words are too long. I don't agree with that at all. Many of my favorite short stories are beyond that length, but it does mean that those longer short stories have to earn the space they take up on the page. I mean, this is going to be especially if you're looking at a print magazine, but even online magazines even have like word count caps, so look out for that. Since slush readers are going through a lot of work at a time, something that I notice with works that are longer that I continue reading is that they have a solid voice. The concept is streamlined. It's not doing too many things. There aren't extraneous elements, and each scene is harmonious. They all work together. They're not disconnected. So I do have some reading recommendations for longer short stories. I couldn't find short stories that were longer than 5,000 words that are like in my top lists. I shared the list in a previous video, so you can check that out. It's in the description of the video, and I linked to all of my favorite short stories. It's quite a long list. I couldn't find any that were above 5K. It also is my preferences as a reader. I do like shorter short stories, but in general, a lot of lit mags will have caps and specifically say in their guidelines that stories on the longer length are going to need to earn their length, or they need to be of exceptional quality. So those are things that you should definitely check out in the submission guidelines. I have 2 recommendations. The first is 5,000 words, and it's Property of Neil by Tamu Tonji. It is free to read on Joyland. I'll link it in the description. And then The Years of My Birth by Louise Erdrich, which was published in the New Yorker and is about 4,500 words. So those are just examples of short stories that I really like because they're very contained despite being large. You know, I've written a lot of stories that are between 1,500 and 2,500 words. Majority of my stories fall into that word count. And being able to see how these stories are longer but still feel like very harmonious is very helpful for me. I think long short stories can be some of the most satisfying short stories out there, because when you find a really, really phenomenal long short story, it won't even read like it's very long. So those are 5 tips on how to stand out in the slush pile. Like I said, this is going to be subjective. It's going to depend on the editor. So of course, trust what each individual editor says. For now, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in another video. Bye.